Good afternoon and welcome to the very first Policy Research Roundtable of EFSL or the Education Forum Sri Lanka. EFSL has been doing a series of policy dialogues since March. Actually, we had our first dialogue in March and then immediately the pandemic took over, but we carried on nevertheless. And we did actually in 7 months, we did 7 dialogues. And we covered topics from curriculum and assessments. And then we immediately got on distance learning, home-based learning, access for disadvantaged children, and then ICT infrastructure and integration of ICT in education, higher education. We covered this whole range of topics, but we were feeling that actually we need to do a little more in-depth into each topic. With the dialogues brought together key stakeholders, we got some very good ideas, but there is a need to go more in depth because our mission is to catalyze policy reforms. So to do that, we need to go with the sound policy proposals and with the sound research behind it. So the idea was then to convene a series of policy research roundtables on selected topics and get some researchers to come together, mostly as volunteers, to synthesize existing research. And with the objective of developing a policy research paper and a policy brief and other communication outputs from those. So we're very happy. Can I have the first slide, cover slide, Sanuja? Right, thank you. So Education Policy Research Roundtable number 1, and the topic is Assessment in Primary Education, Theory, Practice and Lessons with a focus on the Grade 5 Scholarship Exam. Actually, when we did the paper, we purposely tried not to focus too much on the Grade 5 Scholarship Exam, which you will hear later, because we wanted to look at it broadly in very general terms. Otherwise, we get into this sort of, island mentality and looking at only what's been said here. So, and I'm very happy, presenter is Ms. Sanuja Gunathilaka. She holds a master's in education from the School of Education at Harvard. And we have a distinguished panel of reviewers, Professor Angela Little. She's Professor Emerita of UCL Institute of Education, UK, and Dr. Longkai Wu, Research Scientist, National Institute of Education, Singapore, and Mr. Muthu Sivanyanam, former Director Primary Education from the Ministry of Education here in Sri Lanka. So we're very pleased and a very warm welcome to our panelists. And the next slide. Right, the agenda is, I'm going to do a little bit of the context part for about up to 2:40 along with the welcome, and then 2:40 to 3, Sanuja will do the presentation, and then our panelists, the review panel, will have about a maximum of 10 minutes to give their comments, and I hope they will comment on the paper as well as the presentation by Sanuja, and also bring in some information, new information that we,
When he is a bit tall, I think he needs to be.
All right. Okay. I think we need to mute something. Right. 3:30 to 4:50. We have more than 1 hour for open discussion, moderated by Dr. Tara Dimel, and the panel also will be moderated by Dr. Tara Dimel. I did not mention that Education Forum Sri Lanka is coordinated jointly by myself and Dr. Tara Dimel. And she will moderate from 3 p.m. onwards. Okay, can I have the next slide? Next slide, please.
Just a second, it's stuck.
Next slide, please.
Yeah.
No, agenda, next slide, yeah.
Yeah.
Third slide. It's there, okay, I didn't see that. Okay, I'm going to talk from I can't see the slide.
Sorry, it's stuck. Hold on, please.
Okay, context. What's a context? The context is if grade 5 scholarship examination. So the grade 5 scholarship examination is, you will Sanuja will talk more about it. It's extremely important milestone for disadvantaged families in particular. For almost all the children in primary education sit for this exam, though it's not compulsory. Now it's almost by practice, it's compulsory. There are some positives, many negatives, but I feel as a policy analyst, I feel it's a low-hanging fruit in education reforms. That's something we can actually get reforms done with a few changes. The second sort of impetus for this is the presidential task force was formed especially for education. Out of the 3 or 4 task force, we have one on education, which is very encouraging. And the report is not formally out, but we have looked at a draft. And in the public interest, we thought we will go ahead and look at some of the proposals in regard to this particular exam. And 2 proposals that are relevant is proposed to form a cluster of primary schools that feed into designated secondary school. Some people not familiar with Sri Lanka might think, oh, this is the normal way to do structure schooling. But no, in Sri Lanka, we've been talking about this for a long time. And it's, but not being able to implement, we finally hope that will be implemented, because that is going to be part of the proposals that we make. We use that as a given that it's going to be done. And the second one is that the grade 5 scholarship exam to be replaced with a suitable test for admission into secondary school. So those are the sort of policy context. And and next slide, please. Thank you. Terminology, actually our research was a lot about terminology. People use the terms test, exam, assessment, and evaluation interchangeably. And we also found that, it varies by region to region. Europe, they use some kind of definition. In Asia also different definitions. So we actually went back to, our own National Institute of Education teacher instructional guides. Their series, there's 1998, 2009, 2020. They've all more or less, we use that as a basis and for clarity here, because in policy research, you can't have nuances. We need very, very clear definitions. So we say any action, any action taken or tool used by an educator to diagnose or evaluate student learning. So any kind of thing done by teacher to diagnose or evaluate of whatever purpose about student learning, we call it assessment. So diagnose is for understanding, improving, involve collection of documentation of all artifacts. Its formative assessment is also closely goes with that. And evaluate is for reporting or placement and credential and things like that. Summative assessment goes with that that term. Those two go together. So I think I have I have 2 more slides. Can I have the next slide, please? Slide 5, right, thank you. So theory. Now, I had to warn you, there's no high theory here. We have brought it down to policy level, and I'm not going to go through this, but just to tell you that, we start with the 1943 the Committee on Education, Special Committee on Education Sri Lanka, extensive policy document. And then NIE Sri Lanka 1992, where they came up with 5 basic competencies, Delor report, 4 pillars of learning, and so on to date. And what we find is, I'll just give you the general trend, is that, people started with this lofty idea, we don't need to assess or test. The teaching and learning process will give these 5 basic competencies, 4 pillars of learning, and so on. But then we find, more recently, we find there's more demand for accountability by policymakers, funders, governments. So there's more effort on assessment. And if you take UNESCO latest one, I hope Professor Esther Kea is joining us today. She was supposed to. And, we are trying to assess transversal competencies. That is sort of things that cut across subjects. Next slide. Next slide, please. And the practice is, in theory, what we say is for primary children, especially formative assessments, please don't rank them. No summative assessments only, even if you do them only for informing the teaching and learning process. But in practice, primary school children are tested for placement purposes in many countries. We selected only Commonwealth countries here. I put on the first column, it's age, and highlighted are places where they're tested. On the age column, I put the places where they test for the TIMSS and PISA. Sanuja will talk more about it. And the second column is Sri Lanka 1948. We test children at grade 5, at age 9 to 10. And then UK 1944, they start at our grade 6 equivalent, Malaysia, our grade 7 equivalent, and Singapore, our grade 8 equivalent. And what they test is, we test both aptitude and attainment of learning. Again, Sandra will explain more. And UK actually tests aptitude only, and Singapore seems that they test the attainment of learning very thoroughly in several subjects. So again, we are doing both. That's something to think about. We are testing our children early. That's a lesson we learned from there. And I think that's about for practice. And I think I will let Sanuja take you through the real presentation. This was just the context and the build up to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. So just overarching point about this presentation and this session today, the reason why we are focusing so much on the grade 5 scholarship exam is because while it is not the only part of the primary education curriculum in Sri Lanka, we feel all the educational parts in the primary curriculum eventually lead to this culminating exam. So whatever that students are learning in grade 2, 3, 4, 5, they are still having the grade 5 scholarship exam at the back of their minds. So that's why we are focusing on it and using it as a lens to look at primary education as a whole. So an overview of how the grade 5 scholarship exam came to be. Its predecessor was founded, as Sujata mentioned, in the 1940s with the then Minister of Education, who was also instrumental in the free education system of Sri Lanka. And this special committee on education at the time, they focused on holistic education, transversal competency, soft skills. There are different terms to kind of mean the same thing, which means that basically a student is not only learning to memorize things. However, even though they decried this exam mentality, they still initiated the predecessor to the grade 5 scholarship exam. The purpose of that was to reward academically high achieving yet disadvantaged students and reward them with admission to central schools, which were very prestigious schools at the time, and a bursary to support them in their educational expenses. Now we are going to look at how the grade 5 exam has changed over the years. So what you see in bold is new things that have been introduced over time. So it began with language, mathematics, and general intelligence in the 1940s. Then in the 60s, it was briefly changed for students to take the exam at age 12 or 13. However, by 1995 and the present context, it has been changed back to grade 5. Grade 5 is age 9 or 10. So as Sujata mentioned, these students are quite young when they are taking this exam. In addition, the test no longer tests only language and mathematics and IQ, but also environment and the primary curriculum. So there's a lot of memorization involved in addition to aptitude. And in the 2020 changes that are proposed by the Presidential Task Force, as Sujata mentioned, they are looking at the essential learning competencies, that's the primary curriculum, and the IQ. Both of these are not really new concepts, but a new concept that they're thinking about introducing is emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, we will talk about it in detail later, but we are noting here it is a new change, an addition that's proposed going forward. So we want to make sure that we are presenting the positive and negative picture of this exam. So here we are going to highlight some of the findings that we found from the literature that exists about this exam. So one thing which is good is all those who obtain above the district cutoff and are eligible to receive the bursary based on household income, they do receive this bursary. Another change that we've seen over time is after the conclusion of the war, the Northern Province as a whole has improved considerably. However, we are also noticing that there are district level differences within the Northern Province. For example, districts like Jaffna and Vaunia outperform Mullaitivu Kirinochi, etc. Another good practice in assessments of this nature, national level assessments, that the bell curve aligns with the standardized testing practices. That means you have average performers, you have high performers, you have low performers, that corresponds well to these best practices. Another very, very important point is that low income households definitely see value in the grade 5 scholarship, and they are very emphatic that they don't want this completely abolished. We see that sometimes in higher income groups, the parents are saying, oh, we don't need this exam, it's stressful, but low income parents still see value in this option for educational mobility. Another positive that we can see is that all income groups can agree that it needs refinement, particularly as this is a very stressful exam and experience for children. Another good thing is that literally 50% of girls and boys sit for the exam. And another good thing, especially in regards to girls' education, is that girls outperform boys in every province. But we'll discuss later why that may be not only a good thing, but it could also be a bad thing. We'll get to that a bit later. So now we're looking at negatives, and we're looking at negatives in two ways. First way is looking at the educational experience and the content for all students, regardless of their income. So we're looking at their educational experiences that are common across all of these student groups. One notable factor is that compared to the international assessment called TIMSS, which is given to students at grade 4 and grade 8 across the world, and shows how students compare against each other across different education systems, our students do not do well on mathematics. So that means that in terms of international standards, we are not faring that well. Another aspect that we've noted and we've touched on before is that this exam and the primary curriculum that leads to this exam focus so much on rote learning, memorization, and as well as it also introduces things that students may not have learned, that they have no way of really preparing themselves so mentally or academically. So those are some curricular shortfalls that we've realized in the literature. Related to that is a negative impact on children's social emotional well-being, regardless of their income group. They have a very stressful primary education experience. This also harms teachers because even teachers they feel compelled to sometimes teach the test. That means even if they want to do something that's more holistic for the child's overall development, the pressure is there to make sure that the students get high marks in the exam. And again, we are noting that this exam is particularly of high stakes pressure for the most disadvantaged students because they are the ones who have the most to gain from this exam. That's a seg into our equity piece. So we are looking at negatives in terms of advantage and disadvantage. Now, the grade 5 scholarship exam is a good way to look at how the education system in Sri Lanka as a whole is catering to boys versus girls. As we mentioned before, this is great for girls' education that they're performing so well in the exam. But a negative can be that this can be an early indicator of how boys are discouraged or feeling discouraged from learning. They lose interest in school, they might be at more risk for dropping out of school, and this can lead to major issues later on, such as workforce participation. So we are noting that it's an early indicator of a disadvantage. Another very, very important point to remember is that students who perform well on this exam tend to already come from good schools. So that means even if they perform well in this exam, they won't have to even go to a better school because they're already attending that school. So another statistic shows that while 59% of high income students take this exam, 59% of high income students obtain above the cutoff, in contrast to only 41% of lower income students. So this shows that there are disparities in the kind of schools and the kind of household income backgrounds that the students come from. And then we're noticing that 500 rupees bursary, which has been in practice for several years now, is far from enough because the educational spending in households far exceeds that. It's actually more in the thousands level per month, and 500 doesn't really do much for that. Another factor is that the more money that a household has, the more they are able to spend on tuition. And again, this disadvantages the low income students. Another additional point that we are noting is it's not clear in the literature what impact tuition has on students' learning outcomes. However, there's an issue of access to tuition where those who can afford it get it. So finally, we are coming to our recommendations section. So this is based on findings of other policy researchers, other academic researchers, and best practices in international assessments. So our first recommendation is to rename the Grade 5 scholarship exam as a secondary school admission test, SSAT. This is because the purpose of the Grade 5 scholarship exam as it exists now is not only to award bursaries, it is also used for students to go from primary schools to secondary schools, especially for students who attend type 2 or type 3 schools where they might not have all the resources they would need to continue their studies in secondary education. And our recommendation, this recommendation is also in alignment with the Presidential Task Force's recommendations at the moment. How can this be done? So we think we can propose a similar approach to be taken to that of Singapore, where they screen and stream students according to their academic ability and the need for educational mobility. So if there's a very talented student from a difficult circumstance, this system, this SSAT, should be able to help them move, have that educational mobility from one school to another based on their interests and their need. So the second recommendation is to limit testing to numeracy, literacy, and IQ only. This is similar to the earlier version of the Grade 5 scholarship exam that was in the 1940s, where it's more accurate predictor of intellectual aptitude. In addition, the reason why we are taking emotional intelligence out of this, in contrast to the PTF recommendation, is we will discuss that later on in the next slides. But this can focus more on numeracy, literacy, and general intelligence, and also be brought on par with problem solving, reasoning, critical thinking, and application abilities of the students. So we feel that, again, it's important to emphasize that mathematics should not necessarily be made more difficult for students, but the standards and the types of questions and the types of aptitudes being assessed through these mathematics questions can be brought in line with international best practices so that our students have the ability to reason their way through these problem sets and apply their mathematics knowledge to real world situations. So not to make it difficult, but to make it a little different in terms of how it's on par with international standards. So emotional intelligence, that's very, it's encouraging to see that the task force is recommending and seeing the value of emotional intelligence and social emotional learning, because it's in line with the holistic education best practices. However, we are noting that EQ is very hard to assess objectively. For example, it's not just because a student might know, for example, the 4 characteristics of generosity or 4 ways to show how that you are a kind person, that doesn't really mean that they are actually practicing that. It's not like memorizing something in the environment, for example. So we feel it's better to assess schools for their provision of a space for students to develop their SEL. That means is the school the kind of environment where a student feels safe, feels that they can continue to grow, feels that they can be confident about themselves and has good relations with their peers. So we feel this EQ aspect can be assessed not by testing the students, but by evaluating the school environment. Again, in terms of looking at schools, now we are moving into schools, not students. We feel that secondary schools can be ranked against a national benchmark. This is moving into the SSAT aspect after students complete their primary school education. The main reason we are proposing this ranking is that in any given district, not all schools are equal. And actually, some of the literature suggests that even more than the location or the district of a student, their school matters a lot. So for example, you can be in a district that's well-resourced like Colombo, but you can go to a school that is not that well-resourced. So you are still at a disadvantage because of the school you attend. The same thing applies to rural schools that are in more far-flung locations. So we feel that the ranking of the secondary schools can give an accurate accurate picture of the resource to allow room for mobility outside of the home district. The approach that we recommend is similar to what's being recommended for the IZ score reforms in higher education admissions in Sri Lanka. Again, the government has been looking at the schools' characteristics rather than the district characteristics when giving weightage to performance and mobility. Our next recommendation is to ensure that there are enough spaces in higher ranked schools for high achievers. We are noticing this because even if students perform very well at the exam and they come from a disadvantaged background, there aren't enough vacancies in the popular schools. That means the more prestigious, the more well-resourced schools, in those schools, the students are already there. And so there aren't enough vacancies for high-performing disadvantaged students. And so this is an equity piece. It's not fair if a student performs very well on this exam and they don't have an option to move into a better school. So how we propose this being done is to gradually limit and regulate entry to secondary schools based on SSAT performance and need for educational mobility. So basically make sure that there are enough vacancies in these good schools for the students that deserve to be there. Our next recommendation is similar. It's to give priority to high-performing students from low-ranked schools. Again, we are noting this is because one of the purposes is educational mobility for academically promising students. So in any given school, again, in any given district, again, all schools are not equal. And educational mobility should not be confined to a student's existing location or district only. So this means in practice, we are saying, how can this be done? In practice, that can mean that if a student from a relatively underperforming district performs very well on the exam, and a student from a high-performing district or school performs even better, still the student who performs, say they get 80 and the other student gets 90, the student who gets 80% from the lower resource school setting or district still has a higher chance of entering a well-resourced school, which is a chance they may not have had previously. In line with that, we are noticing that educational mobility is not only about giving the chance, it's about making sure that there are enough financial incentives and resources for the student to continue learning. So in its original design, we are noticing that the facility did provide boarding facilities and a stipend for the student and the family, because they would often be moving outside of their home area. And we're noting that 500 rupees is not enough. For example, even in under-resourced districts, the school spending, the household spending on educational expenses reaches the thousands. So 500 we feel is not enough. So how can this be done? We feel this is quite straightforward actually as far as recommendations go. This can be increased to cover the boarding, travel, and other educational expenses of high performers. So to sum up, this is a list of our summary of recommendations. 1, rename G5SE as a secondary school admission test. 2, limit the testing to numeracy, literacy, and general intelligence. 3, gradually bring mathematics questions up to international standards. 4, evaluate the school environment for social emotional outcomes, not students, for emotional intelligence. 5, rank the secondary schools against national benchmarks to show what schools are doing well and how schools can be improved. 6, ensure sufficient spaces in higher ranked schools for high achievers in SSAT. 7, give priority to high-performing students from low-ranked schools and backgrounds. 8, provide bursaries to cover all educational expenses associated with performing well in the G5SE and continuing on to secondary school. So this is a summary of our recommendations, and I am going to stop sharing my screen now. Thank you. Jata, I think you're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. Hello, thank you, Sanuja, for spending right on the dot. Can I ask Dr. Tara Dimel to take over and start calling on our panelists and moderating the review session and then the open discussion. Tara,
Thank
over
you
to
very
you.
much. Thank you, Sujata, and thank you very much, Sanuja, for a very comprehensive, also very lucid presentation, which is really going to set the stage for the discussion as we move into the reviewers. Let me once again warmly welcome our very eminent panel. A warm welcome to Professor Angela Little, who is going to start off the review panel, who is firstly a very close friend of Sri Lanka before being a former professor and an expert from UCL Institute of Education. She's been working with Sri Lankan education systems for at least 2 decades, if I'm not mistaken, Angela. And I've had the great privilege of working with her during my tenure, and she's kindly consented to be a reviewer. So we are looking forward to hearing from her. Professor Longkai, we are very happy that you have volunteered to join us and also to be a reviewer today. And we really look forward to hearing from you, not just about the paper that was sent by Sanuja, but whatever else you need to say about her presentation. We have Mr. Muthu Sivanyanam, who has been a very senior educationist, working in the Ministry of Education in primary education. He was also the director for Education for All. He's worked very closely on primary education with Professor Angela, so he has a wealth of experience behind him. So each of our reviewers will have 10 minutes each. We are going to start now with Professor Angela, and we hope to wind up with Mr. Sivanyanam at 3:30, at which point we are going to move into the open discussion. Angela, would you mind unmuting your mic, and over to you.
So, Aibwan and Wanakam, and good afternoon to you all. It's good morning here, but I wish you good day. And Tara, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. In fact, I have been working with colleagues in Sri Lanka for more than 4 decades.
Oh.
I think perhaps you were a little bit kind in saying 2 decades, but you can see from the colour of my hair that, that time is moving on. But it's true that we started working together, and of course with Mr. Muthu Sivanyanam about 2 decades ago. So thank you, Sanuja and Sujata, for your excellent presentation and your excellent paper, which I enjoyed reading very much. I have made some very detailed comments on the paper, and I will send those after the forum is completed, in case you find them helpful. I think my comments fall into 2 main groups. The first is to stand back a little bit and consider the purposes and goals of assessment, and the different characteristics of assessment and the different kind of impact that they can have on children and children's learning. And then the second broad set of comments is to go back to the question of the purpose of assessment. I'm going to be devil's advocate, and I'm going to ask the question, why do we need an admission test at all? And I want to link that question to the broader reforms that I've been reading about. So also, I think I'm not the best timekeeper. I've got my watch here. Tara, if you would give me a signal, maybe 2 minutes before the end, I'd be very grateful. Okay, now in the paper, you've given us an overview of different definitions of assessment and evaluation, which have been used by the National Institute of Education and also by international organizations. And I would agree with you entirely that it's a bit of a morass. It's quite difficult to find very precise definitions of assessment and evaluation which are used consistently throughout the international literature. The terms are used in different ways and they're used very inconsistently. So I appreciate very much your attempt, having done this review, to make a rather clearer distinction between assessment which is for diagnosis and assessment which is what you call for evaluation. And I think that using assessment for diagnosis and using assessment for evaluation is a very, very important distinction. And I think it's one that you, having made that distinction, you should then try and maintain it throughout the paper and throughout any discussions that you may have with the Ministry of Education and other authorities in Sri Lanka. So I think you've touched on the question of who is being assessed. Is it the individual that's being assessed? Is it the school? Is it the zone? Is it the province? Is it the entire system of education that is being assessed? I think when you're talking about the grade 5, of course, you are talking very particularly about assessment of the individual child. But assessment does have these other targets, if you like. Assessment is used to make statements about schools, zones, provinces, and the whole system. What does it lead to? What is the purpose of the assessment? Is it for selection? Well, I think that in my understanding of the Sri Lankan case, when most people use the word assessment, the other word that is ringing in their minds is selection. Assessment is used for selection in very, very frequently, very regularly. And I think it's sometimes quite difficult for people to take that word selection away from the word assessment or evaluation. I think the key thing is whether the activity of assessing learning is whether it is graded or non-graded. Now, if you are trying to use assessment for diagnosis purposes, what you're trying to do is to diagnose where the learning error is occurring, and you're trying to make, you, particularly the teacher, is trying to make decisions about what the next step of learning should be, both for the teacher in terms of their teaching and the learner in terms of the learning tasks that they undertake. But that can be a judgment which does not have to be graded, and that judgment does not have to be recorded. It is simply an understanding between the teacher and the student, and it is intended to create immediate information. I think in terms of improving learning overall in the education system, it's this type of diagnostic, or many would call this formative assessment, that is in need of tremendous development and indeed understanding by the curriculum developers, by the assessment experts, and indeed by the teacher educators and the teachers. So I think there's a suggestion in part of the paper, or perhaps it was in the general proposals, that we should be assessing students quite frequently over a period of time, and we should have a portfolio of outcomes. But those portfolios also tend to be graded. And as soon as something becomes graded, it becomes high stakes for both the teacher and the student, and it does not necessarily lead to any change in the behavior on the part of the teacher or the student. So it's not being used diagnostically. Often what happens is that you have a lot of assessments, maybe at the end of the unit, the end of the week, the end of the term, the end of the year, and you have a variety of different kinds of tasks, and you put this all into a portfolio and you call this continuous assessment. And it is continuous, but it's continuous summative assessment, not continuous formative assessment. And I think that often the word formative is used to mean continuous summative assessment in the Sri Lankan experience. At least that has been my experience of discussions with policymakers on the one hand and with teachers on the other hand. So I think that I will just move on now to my second set of comments, and I'm going to be devil's advocate. And I'm going to say, why do we need an admission test at all? You've proposed renaming the grade 5 scholarship exam as a secondary school admission test. But also in the reforms, we have seen that there is the suggestion that primary schools will be separated off from secondary schools. They will become distinct schools with their own identity, their own well-qualified school principal, and that there will be a cluster of primary schools around the secondary schools that will feed in to those secondary schools. So the question arises, why do you need a test at all? You have referred to the Singapore example, and you've also referred to the UK example. Now, as far as I understand the Singapore example, this is used because there is streaming at the end of primary, and students are streamed into schools which offer very different curricula. That is not the proposal in the Sri Lankan case. You actually have in Sri Lanka a very comprehensive school system. All the students are moving on to follow the same curriculum until at least grade 11. So you already have a comprehensive system. In the UK, we did away with what was called the 11 plus, which is kind of equivalent to your grade 5. We did away with that as soon as comprehensive education started to be introduced. Now, it didn't all come in at the same time across the whole country. It was phased in gradually, but there was no need for an admission test once all students had the opportunity of going to secondary education, which you've had in Sri Lanka for a very, very long time. My final comment is relates to, if you like, the social demand question. And I think this is a very important one because there will be a lot of politics surrounding this. The demand for the grade 5. You say that low-income families in disadvantaged areas are very, very keen on the grade 5 exam because it gives their children the chance to get their children into a better school. And I understand that very much. At the same time, you say that the, if you like, the middle classes are not so keen, or at least they think it's a waste of time and creates a lot of unnecessary stress, because why do they need it? Their children are already in grade 1 of the popular schools, so they have guaranteed access to the secondary schools. But if the ministries or if the government proposals to separate primary schools from secondary schools comes into force, what indeed will happen to that guaranteed access from grade 5 to grade 6 in the national schools? Will it not be the case that in those schools, the children will also have to take the admission test? Then I wonder what the middle classes who currently get their children into those schools will think about this new secondary school admission test. What I think is missing from the proposals overall is a really good, sharp discussion about the provincial schools, the national schools, and indeed why we need this separation at all. And so if you like, what I'm doing here is I'm broadening your question, the very good analysis you've done of the grade 5, I'm trying to locate it within the broader reforms of education. And I'm going to be devil's advocate and say that I'm not at all sure that you need a revised admission test at grade 5. Maybe we should be thinking about focusing our energy on grade 11, where indeed there will be in the future some clearer separation between different curriculum streams that the students will follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Angela. I'm straight away going into Prof. Longkai. Over to you. Would you like to unmute your mic, Professor?
Can I share my screen? Can
Yes.
you see me as a co-host? Then I can share my screen. Okay.
Great, sure. Right.
So because I think I read the report and I try to understand, because I can only try to understand your action comparing to Singapore's case. So I think I can find certain kind of contrast between the PSLE and with your case. So because now Singapore is trying to make a transformation of the PSLE, so which is so for the students to be taken on primary 6, right? And then for this one, we can see that for the PSLE, so there is English, there's mother tongue, there's mathematics, there's science. So these subjects will be tested. And because in your case, you mentioned you will also be testing the numeracy, talking about the language, talking about the EQ. I don't know. So that's kind of it's true that EQ is very hard to be tested. So then it makes makes things a bit complex in the practice. So that's one concern I have for you're trying to introduce EQ test in this kind of uh, uh, entry. So for the so-called for the entry test for the secondary education, and then for the okay. So because in Singapore, we can see that for all the students, except for the subjects, they also need to do the project work. They also do the CCA, co-constructional activities. They need to do the so-called programs for attend programs for active learning. And then, so there are different, you can see that for the students from primary 1 to primary 4, they can do differentiated activities according to the different levels. So that it means that there are some certain so-called differentiated instructions for the different levels of students. Okay. Okay. So then PSLE. So it's really for the. I think this for this part is quite consistent to the Sri Lanka case. It's really the primary education. It's is considered as a key phase for students to develop language and numeracy, right? And then so the PSLE were to try to assess how the students can learn over the 6 years, and then whether they can acquire a sufficient academic foundation to assess and the benefit for the secondary education. So it's really how to make a linkage between the primary and the secondary education. And then it's also try to let the students, so parents, teachers, to determine whether each student's strengths, and then try to make the secondary education to be more tailored. So that's why I think I think the so-called streaming of the different tracks for the students. So I think so that's the key change for that will be made from next year, from 2021. So because previously we have three streams: express, normal academic, and normal technical streams. But this kind of three streams will be phased out by 2024 and be replaced by the G1, G2, and G3. And altogether, even the test will be judged by the scoring bands instead of individual scores, because they don't think that the 1 point or 2 points of differences cannot make a major difference to judge a student. So then they try to introduce such scoring bands, so then the students can have more time. So it's a more loose assessment for the students. So I don't know whether this kind of change can make a lesson, can be some kind of lesson, or for Sri Lanka to learn from, or we can learn from each other. Okay. So okay. So for the change, you can see that the change for the PSLE scoring are meant to reduce the overemphasis on academic results. So we are really trying to reducing so-called a very fine differentiation at a very young age. But this, you can see that this kind of very fine differentiation has been existed for many years. From the foundation of Singapore, I think it has already been over more than 14 years. So, but this system will be changed from the next year, and we also to recognize the students' level of achievement, And it's now we are not trying to compare a student with their peers, but try to judge a student to consider their progress. I think that's a key change in mindset, right? So by using this kind of so-called achievement level, then this kind of achievement level will be replacing the subjective score. So it means that they will have this kind of so-group in groups. So the similar abilities of students will be assigned in similar this kind of groups. So it will be a much fair assessment of the students. Okay. And then, so the score will be better reflect their own performance instead of comparing with their peers. So in this case, they can be more focused on their own learning instead of try to outdo others, try to reduce the very intense competition among the students. So that's the rationale. And so then what does that mean? So this is a big change and a big transformation. I think we also need to know whether it can really be workable. So that means that we will have 3 years from 2021 to 2024, 3 years to see how the streaming will be phased out. So it will be a time of window. We can see such a big change to take place. I think this kind of phased out approach is also something maybe Sri Lanka can be aware, because we cannot do it overnight. So we need a time for the change to take place, especially to the whole education system. This will be a very big change, very fundamental change for the whole system. So we need time for all the changes to make happen. Okay, and then okay, so we can see that there will be learning and not marks, not just by marks, but by this kind of achievement levels, and then we try to encourage them on their own learning. Okay, so this is about our NIE's role in how to make this change happen. So I think in your report, I guess you are still trying to differentiate different types of schools or different levels of schools, right? But now in Singapore, we are talking about every school is a good school. So we don't want so-called all the high achieving students will go to those elite schools. So that's actually in practice, maybe such a phenomenon still exists. But at the system level, the MOE is to make a change. They are trying to make balance of the resources. They are trying to give all the resources to different types of schools. And because previously we have so-called feature schools, but then this kind of feature schools the idea of feature schools has been abandoned because when the resources to a small number of schools actually is not so-called a good way to achieve education equality. So that's a big concern. So that's why we think that for NIE's role, we are working with different types of school, because NIE is considered as the heart of education in Singapore. So as actually NIE is really taking a very important role in working together with MOE, then in collaborating with the school to make this kind of transformation to take place. So we have, NIE has been delivered this kind of future ready programs and the pedagogies. And then we have a new philosophy. It's called as the life wide, life deep, life wide, life. So this we have this kind of new guiding framework. And then we are trying to say that how to make this kind of whole life framework that can be applied in the school education. it's really about, it means that learning has definitely gone beyond the subject level. We need to help them to be the lifelong learners, to be the life deep learners, to be the life wise learners, to be the life wide learners. So this is kind of the so we are trying to focusing on this kind of social emotional regulation and well-being of the students. So, but then the issue is really about, if under such a formalized framework, how we can make such an assessment. So that's really a key challenge we are facing. But more or less, I think for Sri Lanka's case, we need to, so yeah, my suggestion is like, I don't know, yeah, so the one thing is really about the EQ. How can we, yeah, EQ to me is a very ambiguous term that should be used in the education system. And then for the, especially, yeah, so then it's really about what's the role of the PSLE of your Sri Lankans that so the key is how to make the connection very tuned, a very, the connection between the primary education and the secondary education to be better connected. So that's the key purpose for the exams. So that's not for the jargon of the different levels of students. So that's my point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. I will invite Mr. Sivanyanan to start. We are a little out of our time frame, but Mr. Sivanyanan, you have about 7 to 8 minutes for your presentation, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. The study serves as an effective precursor because different aspects related to the subject of analysis have been addressed to lay a sound foundation for further in-depth study and resultant action. The theory and practice part has explored the nuances of assessment of students' learning outcomes. Formative assessments are encouraged, while summative assessments with an element of competitiveness are discouraged by the UNESCO. I feel underscoring this crucial fact is timely in the context that in Finland, which is one of the top performers in PISA, there are no national level tests for primary grades. Finnish schools do not rank students. The national curriculum discourages competition and instead places focus on cooperation and helpfulness. The formative continuous assessment system is based on around improving instruction and learning. Positive, timely feedback is given to improve learning. The feedback is important, immediate feedback. Malaysia and Singapore are following the path of Finland and scrapped lower summative exams in all lower primary grades. Finland experts have invited by these two countries to help improve their assessment system. In addition to listing the merits of formative assessments, the study highlights the shortcomings in the administration of grade 5 scholarship test. Too much orientation towards scoring high marks and shortfall in content validity in the grade 5 scholarship exam prompts teachers to teach for test at the expense of ignoring the goals and objectives of the national curriculum. There is no scope for children to learn the transversal skills or competencies which are essentially the 21st century skills. Most of this is acquired through social, emotional, and ethical learning. I would like to point out that the Sri Lankan primary education curriculum has been designed well enough to suit the emerging learning needs of the children with 7 objectives leading to the 8 national education goals. The curriculum has provided guidelines for continuous assessment in the classroom to identify children with different learning needs and support them through remedial instruction. The curriculum framework is adaptable enough to incorporate differentiated instruction with multi-level approach, which has been piloted in some selected schools in selected districts by the UNICEF with the support of the Ministry of Education. Though there are some shortcomings in the list of the essential learning competencies and in the pedagogical skills of the teachers in carrying out formal and informal assessments with quality, the high emotional stake associated with the grade 5 scholarship defeats the laudable intentions of the national curriculum. People resort to organize functions to celebrate the high ranking students and praise them. And they are afforded with a lot of uh, prizes and encouraging awards. In spite of the negative effects of the grade 5 scholarship exam, the study proposes the remodeling of this test because the low income families are in support of this test, though the well to do families are reluctant to support it, saying that it is a waste of money and time. The proposals are rational and justifiable, I think. The schools are likely to reclassify it into primary schools and secondary schools with an admission test for enrolling in secondary schools. This classification and separating the primary schools would be beneficial for the hitherto primary schools overshadowed by the secondary schools. In fact, there is a possibility that we can formulate different budgets line for primary and secondary education that would ensure channeling of adequate resources to the primary schools. The proposed establishment of clusters of schools by the Presidential Task Force has been taken into consideration by the study while making rational proposals for ranking the clusters against national benchmarks so that high performing students could move into the secondary schools in the higher ranking clusters. Proposal of giving negative weightage to the proximity of the secondary school from the originating school of the student selected for admission to a better secondary school is also rational. Assessing schools in relation to the provision they have made for mindfulness practice in the school so that children enjoy experience a conducive environment for learning social, emotional, and ethical learning in addition to enhancing their value system. This is a crucial recommendation because most of the transversal skills or the 21st century skills fall into traits that can only be developed through the above skills. I would suggest it is pertinent to take into consideration the Incheon Declaration and framework for action for the implementation of the SDG 4 at the World Education Forum 2015 held in Incheon in South Korea while moving further. It is also important to take note of the STEM currently being in schools in Sri Lanka. The proposal for STEM was approved by the Cabinet of Ministers on 29 August 2018, and the budget proposal 2018 allocated 85 million rupees to the MOE. STEM proposes to establish two key stages, grades 1 and 2 in key stage 1 and 3, 4, 5 in key stage 2 in the primary and revise the curriculum. The STEM also proposes to remodel the grade 5 scholarship and establish a modality for selecting students from disadvantaged areas to prestigious secondary schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sivanyana. We can now open the forum for discussion. And just to encapsulate the key points that was drawn in by the three reviewers, if we just take one step back and recollect what Sujata said as to why the grade 5 scholarship has been implemented for so long, taking para out of the Ministry of Education Exams Department website, it's mainly to give opportunities for admission to brighter students to the secondary school, and also to provide bursaries for those who are from disadvantaged families. So we have Angela coming out with the devil's advocate position and backed up her argument extremely well, asking why do we need an assessment at all? And if indeed the task force reforms become a reality and the decoupling of the primary and the secondary schools occur, then we really don't need this in the first place. Siva more or less supported that view. And the other important point that came out from this is whether the students who are just eligible in the sense in terms of low income, would it be fair only to allow them access to this, or would you open the exam out for everybody who is in a high or middle income level, who are already in the grade 5 of a school that is considered very highly popular or very prestigious? So we have basically those points before us. And one other point that Siva brought out, which I thought was very valid, is that here we have a set of primary curriculum reforms that are proposing so many new things, so many important, creative, valid things. But the grade 5 scholarship exam as it is actually defeats the very objectives that the primary curriculum sets out. So firstly, do we continue with the primary curriculum? Will you continue with the grade 5 scholarship exam? If not, do we remodel it and bring in the SSAT as our researcher has proposed with all its entrappings, or do we look afresh? So I think it's an extremely important discussion. I see Professor Esther Kea on the screen, who has a lot of experience behind us. She's from the University of Melbourne. Please, may I invite Professor Esther Kea to start the discussion. And you know the housekeeping rules. Please put your hands up or put a comment on the chat if you want to make your intervention. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you all, and I can hear a lot of different things coming in. And what you just said makes a lot of sense. And it comes back to what is the assessment framework that the country wants to adopt. And at the moment, it sounds to me as though you have an assessment, the function of which has changed. And so it's a matter of, do you retain that assessment, that particular examination or strategy, and apply it to a different function or not? So I'd like to just go back, picking up a little bit on Professor Little's discussion of assessment, as well as picking up on Dr. Longkai's talk about the achievement levels. So as we all know, another major function of assessment is around accountability for the system. And I'm not sufficiently familiar at the moment with Sri Lanka's assessment framework. So I don't know if you actually have another primary school assessment that provides system level information that will tell us, is the system actually functioning effectively? And what really brought me to thinking about this particular issue was when I think right at the beginning, there was the mention about there's the bell curve, and this is a positive. Now, the bell curve, of course, is very much identified in many people's minds with IQ. And in fact, you have included IQ as a possible candidate within your grade 5 examination. Now, I would have thought that if you have a well-functioning a well-functioning education system, that you would not be looking for a normal distribution, because what we want is that we're going to give equal opportunity to all students to develop. And we know that a majority of students can progress through a normal primary school and secondary school curriculum. So a well-functioning education system is not going to produce a bell curve. We need to think about the value add that education provides. So I think there's a bit of a moral question around that. So, and that of course then takes us to a competency-based approach of education. And that I think came in very clearly from Dr. Longkai, where he starts talking about achievement levels. In other words, we work out what are the achievements that we expect of students. And then if we go back another step, that takes us back to some of these more holistic competencies around the problem solving and the critical thinking, and us starting to teach students, how do you go about solving a problem or analysing an issue? And if we can go to a competency-based and processes, then we start to overcome some of these sort of concepts around intelligence and IQ. So that was one sort of part of my thinking. So I'll stop on that little issue there and just go to one other point I wanted to make. And this was where it was very interesting how you were saying EQ, it's really difficult to assess. And of course, a lot of these other competencies that we're interested in, particularly in the social emotional sphere, are really difficult to assess. And so you mentioned this alternative of, let's look at the opportunity to learn instead. Let's look at what the schools can do. And my personal perspective is that that's a great way to think about it. We need to think about how much of this is actually embedded in the curriculum, how much of this is integrated right through the curriculum, because if we're talking about assessing whether it's actually evaluating what the system is offering or assessing students, we need to make sure that it's actually all embedded in the curriculum. One of the things that I'll stop it in like within a minute. I know I'm talking for too long. One of the things that I'm involved in at the moment is doing a pilot for UIS, UNESCO Institute of Statistics, of a new indicator for Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, which we're referring to as 4.7.6. And that really is about identifying exactly what you were talking about, which is, are the schools offering the opportunity for students to develop problem solving, collaboration, critical thinking skills, all of which would in the longer term contribute to the development of global citizenship or sustainable development and so on. So I think that that's a very interesting approach that you're taking, and it's very consistent with what we're seeing globally in terms of many countries saying, look, it's too difficult to assess across the board with all students, but let's make sure that the actual opportunity to develop those competencies is being provided. So I hope you have a look at the pilot reports that come out of that project in the next month or so. Thanks for the opportunity to talk. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much. Before I would like Dr. Ginige is with us. She comes from the NIE. I think she's also had something to do with the Presidential Task Force. Before that, Sujata or Sanuja, would you like to respond to any of our reviewers or to Professor Esther Kea before I invite Dr. Ginige to make a comment?
I think one thing that I would say is that we wish there were a way to kind of eliminate this type of testing altogether. But unfortunately, at the moment, the nearest school or every school is not the same. So I think if we were to remove grading or such assessments altogether, it would mean that we're working on an assumption that everyone's receiving the same type of education. But at the moment, that's not the reality in the picture. So we only hope that it will get there eventually, similar to what Singapore is doing, that every school is great and every learning experience that the students are getting is great. So that's one overarching comment I would make at the moment. It's just, unfortunately, the resources and the educational experiences are not the same. Thank you.
Sujata? Unmute. Sujata, you need to unmute, please.
Yes. Actually, I'll start with Esther. Esther, thank you very much for being here. You were here with us in 2018, I believe, and you gave a very really good lecture on assessments, and you participated in a workshop. And I'm glad to hear that, you were sort of reaffirming, and actually we got that idea for that we should be assessing spaces, not assessing space for developing these transversal competencies or the opportunity for developing, not assessing the student. So I was glad to hear you reaffirm that. And but I think what I'd like to reiterate what Sanuja was saying. Yes, I think we need to probably in our recommendations, I think Sanuja, we should that there should be a set exam the ranking of schools, and we give each sort of the differentiation indicator, what's a level of discrepancy. We can get there's a measure for that discrepancy, and we should monitor discrepancy, and with the aim of actually doing away with the this primary school, secondary school admission test. But as I would reiterate what Sanuja was saying, no, it's actually at this point, the disparities are too high. But I'd like to ask, actually, if we can go further, I'd like to ask Longkai 3 questions. Actually, there was some very interesting points. You said there's a gifted students are identified. I just like to know a little bit more about that. In P2 or P3, you said primary 2 or 3, and the other one is, the ministry, the claim is that the exam, PSLE, will tell the parents the strengths of the students, but does it tell anything more than the cognitive ability? See, what are the other strengths, which are not other transversal, intrapersonal, interpersonal, creativity, and, citizenship, and maybe other particular artistic, athletic, all that kind of, are those, where do they identify? Is there a way to, at grade 8, is there a way to track that? And third one is, every school is a good school. Actually, do you have a system for assessing schools? Or I'm sure in Singapore, schools are pretty good, but is there like a way to rank the schools or assess the schools? So 3 questions actually for Longkai, if I may, Tara, to clarify. Would that be okay?
Yeah, Professor Longkai, please go ahead. You'll have to unmute your mic, please.
Yeah, I just have 2 questions. One is about gifted education. One is about every school is a good school, right? So
there's a third one. I'll tell that.
Yeah. So because my sound is not very clear, so I can only get 2 questions.
Okay.
So I try to answer these 2 questions. So one is about the every school is a good school. This kind of philosophy. I think this philosophy does not start at the very beginning of the so-called education reform. So, but it's only like a few years ago. This kind of, because you know that there's also a gap. So historically or traditionally, there are some gaps between among those schools. Definitely there's those so-called charter schools that has been doing quite well. There are also some schools there because you know that in Singapore the birth rate is also low, so there is a lacking of students for every schools to be filled. So we also know that there are certain schools has been closed because of lacking of student numbers. So in this sense, but in this sense. Especially for the ICT, the ICT, initially ICT is not well prepared for all the schools. But then gradually, because of the master plan, because Singapore has experienced a phase of so-called Master 1, Master Plan 2, Master Plan 3, Master Plan 4, now it's Master Plan 4. So then we can see that all the schools has been equipped with the ICT resources. And we can also see that ICT has really played a very important role in helping the learning and teaching to happen is whether it's in primary school or in secondary schools. And because of ICT, actually the resources for the schools has been more balanced. Because I know, yeah, because
Okay.
Suyata, you know that, you know your case, because last time we discussed together on the ICT of the, so that's the sense. So we can see that, yeah. So for the first question is about this it is about this kind of so-called gifted education. Yeah, so we because definitely for this kind of gifted education to take place, because I know that at the especially P3, primary 3, some students will be selected, will be identified. Then because they could be so-called in the so-called neighborhood schools. Neighborhood schools means those so-called normal, the normal level schools. So they can still be selected for those so-called better schools. So there's still such a practice that's been taken place because of this. For these kids, they have been shown their competency, they show their talent in numeracy, in language. They have been performed quite well, so they can be chosen for so-called gifted school. So then because I don't know whether in Sri Lanka you also need to take the A level, right? It's the same as Singapore, right? Yeah. So because now for now it's like the PSLE has been playing a very important role in differentiating, in streaming different levels of students. So for the O level or A level exam takers, it becomes less challenging than the PSLE. So it's actually now the PSLE, when the PSLE's role has been kind of decreased, the importance has been decreased. So I think there's still, so because that's really about the essence of education. I think for the education, one purpose of education is also try to picking up so-called talented people. So you know that, so in Singapore, for the high-ranking officials, they all come from very good, they all have very good education background, right? So they have been differentiated. So you can see that a certificate, a good certificate is very important for one person to be recognized by the school, by the society, so they can find a good job. They can find a good job in the government. They can find a good job in the society. So it means that this kind of talented people still need to be identified, still need to be picked up by the education system. Yeah, even we realize every school is a good school, but the talented people still to be come out from the whole system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Longkai. Dr. Ginige, would you mind making some comments on the paper and as well as some of the responses by Professor Little with regards the whether to abolish the grade 5 scholarship exam or not? Dr. Ginige?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I like to make 2 or 3 points. The first one is about the rationalization of the school system. So for the new reform, which will be implemented in 2023, they are trying to pilot it first in 2022. The main thing is that they are going for 1,000 national schools, 1,000 secondary schools, and a group of primary schools for each each secondary school. So the main school will be the secondary school. It will be surrounded by a cluster of primary schools. So with this sessionalization, there's no need, there will not be any need for the grade 5 scholarship exam. That is one thing that I would like to mention, because this has been a problem throughout, right? We couldn't give good schools to everybody, and we have made the examination system very, I mean, very competitive, and it was not giving a good education for the children of the nation. So one suggestion in the new reform is to go back to the cluster system with 1,000 national, with 1,000, we don't like to call it national schools, 1,000 secondary schools, and each school surrounded by a cluster of primary schools. So all the children will be guaranteed a good school when they complete grade 5. That is one suggestion, one point that I'd like to make. The second one is about assessment and evaluation. There's a difference in the way we use these two terms in the East and the West. The countries of the East, we have been giving prominence to evaluation. Our keyword is evaluation. It has been the keyword over the past years. So evaluation is what we is called the trying to find, making a judgment on the children's performance. To facilitate evaluation, we are conducting assessment. So assessment is a support given to facilitate evaluation. So now actually we have three terms: evaluation as learning, evaluation for learning, and evaluation of learning. These are quite common, popular. So evaluation for learning is assessment. We are evaluating for the purpose of helping the child to learn. So we are giving them feedback, feed forward, and while they learn, this type of assistance is given, and it is called evaluation for learning. The other one is evaluation of learning. That is to make sure that the children have learned, that they have reached the learning outcomes or the criteria or the indicators that are predetermined. So there's a distinction like this. I think this is between the East and the West. The Eastern countries, the countries of the East, the key word for them is evaluation, and for the countries of the West, their key word is assessment. So what we call here is evaluation as learning, evaluation for learning, and evaluation of learning. And another important thing, in our system, we are trying to develop hard skills and soft skills together. So hard skills come from the subject. So when we impart the subject content, or when we get the children to look for the subject content or find out knowledge and meaning on the basis of the subject content, then they are acquiring hard skills. And while they acquire hard skills, we are trying to change the learning teaching process. So when we are moving to the transformation role of the teacher, we were in transmission, we were in transaction, still we are in transmission and transaction, but the objective is to take them to move into transformation role of the teacher. It has been difficult. We have been trying since 2007. That was the reform I pioneered in the new millennium. It's called the first reform of the new millennium, and Dr. Tara Demel was also there helping us. So that was the first reform where we tried to move into 21st century education, where we tried to move away from transmission and transaction towards transformation. So with transformation, we can do two things. We can impart, we are trying to impart hard skills through the subject, and while at the same time, we are changing the learning teaching process so that the students can catch the soft skills. The soft skills have to be caught, I think. We can't teach them, they have to be caught. So hard skills are the subject skills, they come from the subject. Soft skills are coming from the learning teaching process. Thank you very much.
May I just ask a quick question from Dr. Ginige? And after that, I'd like to invite Angela to respond to what she said, if you don't mind. Dr. Ginige, just a quick question. You said the 1,000 well-equipped schools, which may or may not be called national schools, are expected to serve clusters of schools in every province. Did I hear you correct? Did I understand you?
Around each secondary school, well-established secondary school, there will be a cluster of primary schools. Even now we have few schools like that, where the primary schools are providing the students for the secondary schools. So we are guaranteeing everybody, there's a guarantee for every child that he or she would get a good school when they come to grade 6.
So the new 1,000 schools would be over and above the schools that are currently in existence, like the 355 national schools. Is that correct?
There may be selecting. They will select 1,000 schools, and the location will also count, right? Because they have to have a cluster of primary schools around them, and the secondary schools can have classes from 6 to 11 or 6 to 13. At a recent meeting, that was decided.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Angela.
Can I ask a question? Raise hands. Yeah. Actually, I think we need to explain the context here a bit. Why we are talking about reforming the exam and not doing away with it is, we've tried these 1,000 schools now for the last 20 years or so. I mean, it came in different names, and we've tried this having a, cluster and a secondary school, which with the feeder schools. I think that's where in the context, I think we should have said that this is the context. We've been trying to do this, and this is not going to happen overnight. So that's why we need probably the secondary school admission test. I think grade 5 scholarship exams should be continued in a new way because of the reality, because of the context, that it's not going to happen anytime soon. I think 5 years, it'll be optimistic given the financial situation of Sri Lanka, but I think we really need to, that's really, I think, still a little bit of a dream to have 1,000 schools which are sort of more or less equal. And we heard that in Singapore also still, some schools are better than others, and the competition will be there, I think.
Angela?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. A very rich set of comments. First of all, to respond to Dr. Ginigay, I don't think that this terminology question of evaluation and assessment is a major distinction between the East and the West. I think that the distinctions that you've introduced are a refinement of what we've been all talking about this morning. And I like very much the way that you've distinguished between evaluation of learning and evaluation for learning. I think the term evaluation of learning, however, has to be extended a bit, because why are you evaluating that learning? You're hinting that indeed it is some kind of summative evaluation. Other people might call it summative assessment. I don't mind either way, but why are you doing it? Are you doing it for selection? Are you doing it in order to make some sort of judgment about the school or the whole system? In other words, you're doing it in order to monitor the system, or you're doing it for reasons of accountability of schools. So I think that the term evaluation of learning definitely tells us something about this is going to be a summative assessment, but you still have to move one step further and say for whose purpose or for what purpose. So I'm very comfortable with your terminology, but I think we just still have to keep at the front of our minds the way in which whatever kind of evaluation or assessment is done in Sri Lanka, the dominant purpose in most people's minds, whether they are policymakers or teachers or parents or indeed children, is selection. And it's this selection drive that I think we are all feeling the need to reduce in some way in order to create space and opportunity for children to learn with joy, for children to learn without stress. So that's my comment on evaluation. I'm going to just at this point introduce another sort of idea. It derives from my concern to see the place that the grade 5 exam, the place that it has within the whole system of education, and the concern with the popular demand to see that it is maintained, and equally Dr. Gamagay's concern, or the point that she has made, I think, a couple of times quite rightly, which is that now for many decades there have been attempts to reform and upgrade the secondary schools. We've had all kinds of schemes, I think, for the last 20 or 30 years. And for one reason or another, the impetus to maintain those schemes and really upgrade those schools, the impetus has reduced, it has dwindled, and often it has been for political reasons at the national level, and indeed political reasons at the local level. And every few years there's a new reform, a new drive, a new set of resources, and a great fanfare, and we go with this for a couple of years, and then it fades away. I agree entirely that it's a very long-term job to make every school into a good school. But I feel that by going along with tinkering with the grade 5 exam, that we're sidestepping that much bigger question, and that we really have to get to grips with that. Now, one idea I'm just going to float. Somewhere in the draft education proposals, I read a recommendation that said that university entry, the algorithm for university entry should be based partly no longer on a district quota, but on a school quota. Now, if you went with that idea, you have a way of meeting the needs for students in disadvantaged schools who are performing well to get access to the university, especially if you combine it with, and I think Esther might have been hinting in this direction about the value that different schools add to the learning of children. If you have, and it's quite common now in many systems, if you have a way of measuring the value that any individual school adds to the learning of the average child by taking a measure of performance at the point where they enter the school and the point where they exit the school, you could use those value added measures to compensate the slightly lower performance that we might expect from a high-performing student in a low-performing school. Now, this would be a way of meeting the very real need for able, high-performing, very aspirational students from poor communities, from economically disadvantaged homes. It would be a way of helping them to stay in their locality for their secondary education, but giving them an added score. As it is, we know that district quotas have been used in Sri Lanka for many a long year, and I happen to think that this was a very innovative scheme, and there are not many countries in the world that do this. But you have this tradition. If you change from a district quota to a school quota, then you can continue to give advantage to the more disadvantaged child. So I'm taking us forward from the grade 5 test. I'm moving to, if you like, the end of A levels. I'm trying to take a whole system view, because I think it's high time that some of these really big questions were addressed and challenges were met in the Sri Lankan system. I wasn't sure when Dr. Ginigay was talking about the 1,000 secondary schools and then the national schools. I wasn't at all sure what the status of these national schools would be in the next 5 or 10 years. Are they going to continue to be controlled by the Central Ministry of Education, or are they going to be, if you like, given back to the provinces to control? And I have a feeling that the proposals are very silent on that question, but it's that question to me which is fundamental to the operation of the entire primary and secondary school system in Sri Lanka, and which is, if you like, reproducing the need to carry on tinkering with this grade 5 exam.
Thanks, Angela. I too agree with your last sentence. I can't ever see the national schools being handed over to the provinces or to the zones. And also I can't see ever how 1,000 new schools is going to actually address the issue that we are facing. Before I go to anybody else, may I invite Priyatha, who comes from the Ministry of Education, who has also been working with these task force groups to make her comments on what was said so far. Priyatha?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Tara Dimel. I think you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well. Please go ahead.
Okay, okay. So my view is we can't take out this grade 5 scholarship examination issue uh, as an isolated one. Actually, it is related to the system issues. For example, even at the beginning, when this proposal came out in the Kannangara period also, it is related to the social issues. So at that time, there were no enough schools because at that time, the medium of instruction is English in the privileged schools. So to provide that education, that English medium education to normal students in the Kannangara period, as I believe, they established central schools. And if there were limited number of central schools, they established this scholarship scheme for disadvantaged students to provide opportunity to enter, to admit to those central colleges, which the medium of instruction was English. So now I think the grade 5 scholarship, the purposes may be changed. As Dr. Tara Dimel said, actually, when the system started this scholarship examination, as I know, there were only one purpose: to provide opportunities to those disadvantaged and brilliant students to admit to central schools. But now, as you said, there are two purposes mentioned in the Department of Examinations documents. One is the same, and the other one is to provide opportunities to admit to better schools to other students. So that is why I am arguing this is a issue which is related to the whole system. So if we can't if we can't cure the causes, I think we can't actually we can't make a change. For example, as you suggested, the SSAT. The SSAT again, that comes out because we are taking out this issue as an isolated one. But that is not the thing. So as Dr. Ginige said, time to time, actually from the past to present, we have many programs that has to be implemented to make all the schools to take all the schools to the same quality. But still we fail in that interventions. For example, that 1,000 schools program recently, and in SBS, the near school is the best school, and we invested so much money for that. But still we are discussing about what would be the grade 5 scholarship examination. So that's my concern. What I believe is if we did the right things and if we invested our money to the right interventions strategies, so then there's no need to speak about grade 5 the shape of grade 5 scholarship examination. So that's my concern and my argument. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Priyata. Anybody else who wants to make an intervention? We have about 45 minutes more for the discussion. So please raise your hands or unmute your mic and speak.
I would like to respond to Dr. Angela Little's one of her questions. Where do we do assessment and where would we do evaluation? Now we are in an activity-oriented approach. So in the activity, the students have to explore. At one step, they are exploring. That is the learning stage for them. So when they are learning, the role of the teacher is assessment. The teacher has to observe them. The teacher has to listen to them. They are working in groups. The teacher has to move about in the classroom, observing them, and listening to them. So the teacher finds out their strengths and weaknesses. When they have weaknesses, feedback would be provided. When they have strengths, feed forward would be provided. So with the learning, when they are learning, this learning is through exploration. The learning time is reserved for assessment. Then where would evaluation happen? Later, when they are presenting their findings, when they are elaborating their findings, so the students are speaking, then the teacher is listening for evaluation. So that is evaluation of learning. So whatever the learning process, it can be school-based assessment and evaluation, it can be classroom activity-based assessment and evaluation. The learning time is devoted for the assessment, and the presentation and the elaboration times are devoted for evaluation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Can I just respond to that, Tara,
Yes,
please? Yes. Thank you, Dr. Ginige. I think that you're taking us now to the heart of the classroom and the question of curriculum and how the teacher and learner, how they negotiate their learning. And I think that this is the area that we need to have much more discussion about. And this is a very, very positive aspect of our current discussion. Any question about assessment or evaluation, whatever we call it, which is used for selection purposes, is coming at the very end of a very, very long process of day-to-day interactions between teachers and students. And it's these day-to-day, minute-to-minute interactions which lie at the heart of learning and learning achievement. And your emphasis on, in the activity-based approach, you've got feedback for, if you like, remediation, and feedback for, you call it, I think, feed forward. Absolutely vital. And this, I think, is a really, really important part of teacher training. For all levels, primary, secondary, and indeed tertiary teacher training in the education system. The key question I always ask myself is, once the teacher has moved from evaluation to assessment or from assessment to evaluation, does she change her plans? Once she finds that some group of students are not understanding a particular concept in mathematics to the level that she would have expected to, what does she do? Does she just move on blithely to the next page of the teacher guide? Or does she actually change what those particular students might do for their next step of their learning? And this is where the concept of differentiation comes in, a differentiation of task, and there are lots of different types of differentiation. And it's this area which I think that if Sri Lanka is going to invest a huge amount of resource in changing the grade 5 scholarship exam, a lot of that resource should really be invested in this area of evaluation for learning. So evaluation, if you like, evaluation as learning and evaluation for learning, where lots of little assessment steps, if you like, are built into the learning process. And then there is an evaluation, perhaps at the end of a particular unit or a particular lesson. And then the teacher is using that information. We have to help teachers to understand how to understand the errors that children make and how to help children to overcome those errors. And it's this area of education that we need to be spending much, much more time on. I think in every system of education, but we're talking here about Sri Lanka, and I think that it would be to the huge benefit of students and teachers if we got to grips with evaluation for learning rather than evaluation for selection.
Dr. Ginige, you want to respond to that?
I can. Yes. Now we can have a number of solutions. One can be mixed ability grouping. Normally we go for mixed ability groups. Then in the group, there can be people, there can be students who are clear about this concept. Some students may not be clear. So then that the peer help would be given. so they can receive peer help. But if all the students are clueless, then it indicates to us that they don't have the prior learning or something like that. Then we will have to go for remedial teaching. That can be one solution.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Abesing, huh? Could you unmute your mic? Right.
I'm trying to, yes. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you, can hear you.
I like to invite a different perspective to look at these issues from a potential scholar's perspective. Say from a scholar who is coming from a rural school to a prestigious school, you know, he faces enormous challenges to continue his education at the new school. And so far, the discussion has moved on, assuming that, you know, entering into a so-called prestigious school or a so-called good school is a kind of a panacea, that all his problems will be taken care of and he will become a successful person. I was exposed to some three research work done previously, where they tried to assess the success rate of the scholars who have entered these prestigious schools. I don't have the exact details now, but it took note of a significant number of scholars who have entered to these so-called prestigious schools have failed in life, right? Done worse even than the ones who have been in their own schools before they got into these prestigious schools. Now, to give you a sense of the academic standards in some of these leading schools, they have declined significantly over the past few years. The teaching staff have been transferred in numbers. Now, I can speak for Royal College. On 2 occasions, over 100 teachers were transferred out of Royal College. So it disturbs the ecosystem that school had, you know, for years. It has disturbed, and the child walks into a kind of a overcrowded class from a relatively small class in a rural school, and he is in a different world. He is in a culture shock. You know, there are so many other challenges. Finding accommodation in Colombo, or finding transport. You spend a couple of hours traveling back and forth. If you can't get accommodation in the hostel, which is also very limited, and especially a kid coming from a financially challenged background, family background, he will find it extremely difficult to cope with the expenses that are needed to maintain his lifestyle to match with the rest in the class. So there are humongous challenges that such a kid faces, and I'm not sure whether trying to perpetuate a system that has, you know, not been successful in terms of, you know, unleashing the full potential of such students fully, even by tinkering and trying to carry on this for another period ahead. I don't know what results it can produce. I think we need to look at this entire system, as Priyatha said, and also Angela was mentioning this to some extent. I think we need to look at the entire system and evaluate the outcomes from this system so far, and then take a conscious decision as to how it should be modified or it should be continued.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Abesingha. I too endorse most of your views. I just want to refer your question to Sujatha, who is privy to some of the recent research studies done at IPS, I think in 2019, where they showed the massive demand for this scholarship exam. So Sujatha, let me invite you to give an overview, particularly of the IPS study, please. You have to unmute the mic.
Right. Thank you, Tara. The IPS study, what they looked at was very interesting. They looked at the performance of students in several popular schools, and they compared the performance of the children who came through the scholarship and the children who were already there. And what they found was actually there was no difference. But the indirect conclusion is that actually, but if you compare the university concrete office and interest did not do those
Sujata, I think your internet connection is failing a bit. Could you repeat the last few sentences, please?
I see.
Now I think you're okay.
I think, yeah. Okay, good. So the study was they compared the students in the same school, several popular schools, those who came through the scholarship and those who were in the school already starting from grade 1. And what they found was very interesting. There was no difference in their ability to gain entrance to do well in the GC advanced level. And what they did not do is compare the progress of these students compared to those who could not come to these schools. But the parents know that. We need to do that study, but actually these students, they perform better compared to their counterparts who did not get a chance. So these schools do make a difference. It's not the cognitive ability of the students that they find, it is the school that they go to, the facilities. So it's very clear, and parents know that. Parents know that if a child goes to even hardships and everything, they get a better chance of going to university. I don't know what studies you're referring to, Kamal. We need to look at that. But this is a very interesting, I think they took a different stab at it by comparing the students from the same school, those who scored well in the scholarship and those who did not. So let's sort of talk offline about that study. But Tara, if I can just give us sort of general overview comment here. We can talk about better looking at the entire system. Actually, in 1943, we started talking about it, and we are still talking. So I think a valuable lesson I learned from this dialogue is we need to really reframe the whole thing with our proposers. What I would say is using this grade 5 scholarship exam, we have a saying that to get out of the well, you have to come out of the well, wellhead, So we are really, if you look at the second part of the second part of the proposals, really using this as an instrument to rank the secondary schools, improving their performance and making them more competitive. And this is a very real instrument. It's not like some utopian thing where you expect, 1,000 schools who are equal and then there's no need for this. So we start from the premise that there is a need for this. Let's make this an instrument of change, which is where we say you have the clusters, give the children the mobility to go through the clusters, but compare the clusters and give incentives for the clusters to improve and retain the students. So I think it's tinkering is necessary, I think. I think it's necessary, but I really like Angela's comment about tying it with the end. The end is Sri Lanka for most. The average person is to gaining entrance to a free public higher education system. And if we really link this, actually, I'm suggesting, Sanuja, maybe we would look at linking this to the advanced level, what are the criteria? If the criteria tied to a cluster, poorly performing clusters are given some recognition, then I think both these very competitive, very really exam that go against all education principles we know, I think we can use the exams to reform the system. I think to reform the system, it's no point in talking about putting more resources, training teachers. I think we have to use the existing instruments, very powerful instruments, which are these two exams, to make the nudging for changes. Thank you.
Thanks, Sujata. Dilipa has been raising her hand for a long time. Sorry, Dilipa, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'll start with Dr.
Please unmute your mic, Dilipa.
Sorry about that. Yes, so I'll start with Dr. Sujata's comment about greater changes in the system coordinator. I'm just thinking how this idea of in the I think Sanuja mentioned at some point that the low-income family, low-income socioeconomic group wants to have some sort of um, uh, exam that improve their chances for educational mobility to a better school and all that. But then if the masses were educated specifically about the IPS study, for example, as to actually has it really improved their lives? It has it improved the majority of their lives? Then there are questions around it. So I think first of all there's lack of information to the masses about whether the scholarship exam actually changes their lives. So that's one thing to do, but I don't know whether that's politically correct to do so. Because then that's also utopia, in my view, that low-income families, low-income groups believe that the scholarship is actually going to make their lives better. I think far more than that, it probably makes their life worse by putting their children and themselves through a lot of pressure and social emotional challenges at a very young age in that young family, aspiring to that goal that they can't attain because you anyway need money for tuition and etc. And it's highly complicated. So that's what I suggest is, as you say, okay, yes, use it as an instrument, but then I say I couldn't go through the draft proposal. We will do. I didn't have time, but in the next couple of days, we'll comment and send it to you detail. But my one thought is that does this have a roadmap proposed, recommend with certain recommendations as to okay, so we would do with this exact and whatever something we would call that exam. But do we phase it out? Do we phase it out along with secondary schools becoming more and more equal? At what point does this test stop? And schools are going to be clamoring for better schools, which are far little than what is demanded. Oh, okay. At which point I wasn't clear, I'm not sure, but I think at which point did you lose me? Is it better now?
You were unclear throughout, Dilipa. I think it's a combination of a background noise as well as the internet connection, but that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. Actually, I think Dilpa is going to continue, but she's talked about a roadmap that which I thought that's a very good intervention, but does she want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, just so that I can give there are two people who have raised their hands. Dr.
Yes, so it's really not clear.
Sorry. Dilipa, do you want to continue with your intervention or? No. Okay. Dr. Ginige, you raised your hand again.
If my connection is not clear.
Dilipa, have you finished your intervention or do you want to say something more?
Yes, as long as you can hear me, otherwise I'll send my response in writing.
Now we can, but you keep breaking up. That's our only worry.
Okay. Let me do this. Let me change my connection to see whether it improves. Let Dr. Ginige continue until I come back.
Okay. Dr. Ginige, over to you.
I think I like to make two comments. One with respect to the quota system. We were discussing the quota system. We have the district quota system, and now we are thinking of moving into a school quota system. But the quota system has its disadvantages. Now, for example, if we take the National Colleges of Education, where we train the teachers to be, the teacher educators tell us that they have a lot of problems with regard to the students selected to the district quota system, because they are of different standards. particularly for a subject like English. They say it's very difficult to teach them when they are together. So that is one point that I would like to make regarding the district quota system, which we currently have. Then Sujata was trying to mention something regarding ranking of schools. Right. So the ranking of schools also will create problems if we base it on academic success. Right. Academic success means what you do at the exams. If it is based on academic, that is the easiest thing that we can do. So always the administrators will go for academic success. But unless we measure the total personality of the students, unless we see to their overall development, if we make judgments on the basis of their academic success, I think that too also will be a failure. Thank you.
Just one quick question from Dr. Ginige before I think Sujata wants to respond to that. Dr. Ginige, as far as we know from the documents that has been circulating, we presume that that's the document that the Presidential Task Force is going to publish as the set of recommendations to the government on reimagining education. In that, there is no roadmap or any transition phase or anything mentioned. It just talks of a modified form of the grade 5 scholarship exam. And of course, they talk of the decoupling of the primary and the secondary and this 1,000 schools issue. Do you have anything to add to that? This is just my understanding from my cursory glance at the document.
The longer version of the document contains short-term, medium-term, and long-term interventions. And I mean, it's not step by step, but they offer like, 2 years, 5 years, long-term, what could be done. But it's not step by step for each intervention.
So is there a roadmap for the phasing out of the grade 5 scholarship exam, for instance?
Not only that, they've looked at primary education more like in a holistic way. Yeah. Sorry, Sujata.
No, Sujata, I think, do you want to make a comment, Sujata?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think because that's a very high level document and they don't have details. And I think it's actually, this is a time for us to sort of give a roadmap. And I think I like the idea Dileepa said, actually, I think we would reframe, if you were to do this paper again, we look at it as a roadmap. And the ranking of schools question that Dr. Ginige was saying, actually, I think in our paper, we say the ranking would be on inputs, mostly about facilities. So, and one of them would be, of course, the academic outcome, but I think that should be, of course, you have to see not just just gross outcome, but maybe you look at improvements. So this ranking criteria, I think, so there's again a nice bit of research we can do. And if we take the initiative, I think it'll be very welcome. How would you rank a school? I think it should be on inputs at this point, and also not just on net, how many, what's academic, how many get over a certain number of marks in a certain exam, but what did they do better than the previous year? So we could use some very inclusive and very good ranking system that captures real progress and incentivize these schools to progress. So I think in some ways we erred in this paper just talking about just the scholarship exam, and actually it does sound like tinkering. And I really welcome the ideas for doing a roadmap and how we get to this ideal that we are all talking about. The more I hear it, the more I think that actually this scholarship exam is a tool for us to do that, because there's so much interest. It's so important and it's so ingrained in our culture. I think we might as well use that itself to change the system. So that's, we would actually, very good interventions. I really would, I think Sanuja and I will really rethink this paper, I think.
Thanks, Sujata. We have someone with the hand raised. Is it Anushka by any chance?
Yeah, I would like to speak, if that's all right.
Please, yes, please. Sorry,
Yeah.
I missed you. Yes.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for convening this discussion. It was very interesting. And I'm okay with continuing with the exam. And I understand Dr. Sujata's point that there is a demand for it. But within this entire conversation, I'd like to focus, or I don't know if it's possible to do a study, maybe introduce design thinking principles into understanding how to solve the problem of getting these high performing students from a disadvantaged background into the good schools. I think, you know, that gets lost in the conversation with primary education, with the scholarship exam, but to really focus, do a case study, maybe interview some of the students and really brainstorm ways. I feel that this is one of the problems that we really need to find an answer for. You know, with the, it could be through the scholarship exam, it could be through, you know, a financial scheme, it could be through, you know, introducing facilities, it could be, you know, innovative methods of supporting students at home, you know, in neighborhood clusters. I'm saying that there could be out of the box thinking applied to this problem, and that I don't want this problem to get lost in the larger conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anushka. Professor Esther, do you want to respond to Anushka and her angle of not allowing the design component and other methods of getting the students' talents and competencies into consideration? I don't think she can hear me. Anyone wants to respond to what Anushka said? Yes, Harsha, yes.
Actually, it's not only about what Anushka said. I have a few points. One is that I agree with Anushka that, and also Sujata, that year 5 scholarship examination must continue, because it gives some students, those who can perform much better, some kind of, I mean, in addition to bursaries, going to a good school. Now, Kamal said that there are some studies that show that these students are not performing, better than the students, those who are already in classrooms, in so-called popular schools, those who are coming from the primary. But I personally, I have experiences that these studies, I think Kamal must be referring to the study that the Colombo University students are doing from time to time, a research at, one of the places is Royal College. They are comparing the performance of scholarship holders and the students, those who came from the primary. But what I have seen is they are looking only at examination performance. That is not the thing. That what I have seen at Royal College and other schools like DS, Anand, the social capital they are gaining. Those who come from, very remote areas and social capital, ultimately they get, even if they don't pass the examinations, that supported by the old boys associations and likewise, that we cannot neglect. And if, going back to Dr. Ginige, if we are going to have national schools, I can't imagine even having those 1,000 national schools, but if we go to 1997 and 2003, we talk about having one school of excellence for bilingual education. Now, still we have not been able to do that. So talk about this national 1,000 national schools. I don't think that it's a very surreal, thing. So if we are doing that, we are not giving a chance from those students from the remote areas to come to colleges like Royal College. If we are going to assign them those so-called national schools that we are going to have. So we need to think of that. And also theoretically, one thing that I would like to say finally, there is a difference between assessment and evaluation, whatsoever that we talk. There is a theoretical difference. So in such a, I think Dr. Ginige was referring to learning for assessment for learning, assessment for on-learning, something like that. There is a difference between assessment and evaluation, because assessments are part and parcel of teaching learning process. And the final one is, whatever we talk and whatever the policies are brought, what matters is the things that the teachers are doing from Monday morning to Friday afternoon. So unless we do, because I'm teaching teachers, when I ask at master's level, when I ask what the national goals are, nobody, I mean, a few can answer that question. What the generic skills, competencies that you are, I mean, teaching students to achieve, they don't know. So that is the level of teacher training in Sri Lanka. So we need to do all these things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harsha, for that extremely relevant and important input. Would Dr. Ginige want to respond to that, or do we move on?
Harsha is correct, because most of the people who come for training, they come for the certificate, right? To get the next promotion, they need the certificate. And I also have noted this. They don't know even the basic. If they don't know the national goals, the 5 basic competencies that were introduced some time ago, so how can they go forward? So I agree with her totally.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Kamal. Please unmute your mic before you talk. Okay.
Can I respond to Harsha? Was it Harsha who spoke?
Yes, yes.
Okay. There are 2 points I like to make. One on the quality of education. Even a student who is joining year 1 in so-called popular schools, in relation to Royal College, I can speak because I have been working on many initiatives relating to that. The stark ground reality is that many students, even from primary stage, rely on external private tuition than the teaching they receive at Royal College. I think it is the case with other so-called popular schools as well. So when these scholars come, especially from a poor financial background, they cannot afford to have private tuition as much as a student from a a well-off family can afford to have such private tuition. So that leads to a gap, right? And also those who enter the hostel, for example, after they get through O-level exam, they have to leave the hostel, right? They can't stay in the hostel. So if the parents cannot afford to keep that child in Colombo, and if they can't afford to give additional tuition, how can that child achieve the same levels of even academic performance at A-level? It's a very, very tough task for them. So you have about 250 to 275 kids entering Royal College, and each grade you have about 800 students in each grade, right? And probably there's pressure on these kids because perhaps the school they went previously, the entire school would have had less than 500 students. Now imagine coming to Royal College with 8,500 students. How can even the authorities manage the complex affairs of educating, 8,500 students in different grades? And they are lumped together in one school, primary education and secondary education. So that's another challenge. Then I agree with you on the aspect of social capital. Now, even there, the kids coming from poor backgrounds get marginalized, right? Either they cannot afford to participate in sports or extracurricular activities, or if they, some of them travel distances as far as Galle, Gampaha, such places, spending 2-3 hours one way, reaching college and getting back. So such kids cannot participate in sports or any extracurricular activities. They merely become bookworms, right? And they don't socialize with the rest of the students. It's not possible, practically not possible. So what kind of social capital such students can gain? That is the question. I think we need to look at affordability factor if we are getting poor students into so-called good schools and prestigious schools. I think that is an issue that has to be addressed seriously.
Thank you, Kamal. I think Madhavi has her hand raised. Can you unmute your mic, please?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity, Dr. Dimel. I thoroughly agree with what Kamal was saying, because it's very close to my heart what he mentioned. We bring these poor children from faraway places and we plant them in places like Royal College, which has got a very good reputation. But these children find it very difficult to fit in with that society, the school, the environment. And on top of it, they need the tuition backup for them to reach the high standards. It's sad to say that even some teachers have taken it for granted that these children go for tuition so that I don't really have to teach in the classroom. Or some have gone a step forward by even saying, why don't you come for my tuition class instead of teaching in the classroom? So as a result, these poor kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, if I may call them, will be finding it extremely difficult to continue with their education. However intelligent you are at the grade 6, the advantage they have is going to diminish with the years because they are not getting the right education. So in terms of education-wise, they have been deprived, and emotionally as well, because they can't fit in with these particular students because of their social background, their interactions, the parties that they have to go to. So that itself will place another big constraint on these children. And thirdly, as he mentioned, extracurricular activities, as we all know, need a lot of time as well as investment. There again, they will lose out. But if they stayed in their own village or own place, there they would have managed. So in my honest opinion, if we can clone Royal College in every single city or bring up the standard of the schools in every area, we are providing the children not only a good education, but a secure social and emotional backing, which is extremely important when they grow up to be adults. In the adult society, we want the adults to be not only educated, book educated, but we want them to be secure, safe, and confident individuals. So I feel by giving them this great opportunity through the scholarship, giving them to a good school, providing them with good education, we are in a way taking away their individuality. That is my opinion on this particular aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I say something?
Just to remind everybody, we just have about 6 to 7 minutes left. So I'm going to give Harsha 1 minute, then Dileepa 1 minute, and anybody else just 1 minute before we wrap up. Angela, 1 minute. Okay. Harsha, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to respond to what Kamal said. But I agree with all what he said. But we can't take everything for granted, but we need to continue to give our poor students from remote areas to come to Royal College, because I have seen them blooming, right? I have been a teacher at Royal College before becoming a senior lecturer at Royal College for 15 years. So I have seen them, right? In fact, I have given some boys, I was living at Jawat Road then, when they couldn't find hostel facilities, they were with me sometimes, right? So we need to give that. And also, going back to what Madhavi said, yes, we need to do something to assist these boys and girls, those who come there. That goes to what Sujata has proposed in her document, that we need to increase the bursaries, the hostel facilities and everything. Then they will be able to, I mean, go for tuition and participate in whatever the extracurricular activities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dilipa. 1 minute. I hope your audio is clear. Can you unmute and speak, please? Dilipa? Okay, I'm going to Angela, since Dilipa cannot hear me, I think. Angela, you're on. Please unmute. Angela, you have to unmute.
Sorry.
Nah. Good.
Just two quick comments. I think Sujata was talking about the potential value of the grade 5 or exam, or the revised exam, as a way of ranking schools and perhaps using that information to allocate resources to schools, either schools which are particularly schools that are improving, but perhaps also to schools that need a lot of support. But we do have another way of doing that. We do have the national assessment system in place, which has been running now for best part of 15 years. And we do have assessments of essential learning competencies at grade 4. And that scheme could be intensified. I wouldn't suggest that every child in the country has to take a test at grade 4, but I would think that every school could be tested at grade 4, and there could be a light sampling process used. And that way you would use the test information for monitoring, accountability, and resource allocation decisions, but not for selection decisions, because as soon as you involve every child and start using it in some way for selection, then you go back to all the backwash problems that we've been talking about this morning. So there is another way of ranking schools using the national assessment system, which is quite distinct from, quite separate from the grade 5 scholarship exam. And my second comment is really picking up on Madhavi's comment about cloning Royal College in every province and in every district. And I really like that idea. And I really like that idea, not least because we know that Royal College has very high standards and extremely good teachers. But also my understanding is that Royal College is multi-ethnic. And there is in the proposals, the broader proposals, there is a proposal to establish a number of schools that will admit students from all ethnic groups. And I think that would be an incredibly good way forward, and link it with the cloning of the most popular schools in every district. And that would give, I think, a huge push to raising the quality of the underperforming schools, bring them up over a long period of time to the level of the national schools. Indeed, why don't we call all schools national schools? And then you could have this extra layer on the top, which are the multi-ethnic schools, drawing on the best practices which Royal College and other popular schools, which are multi-ethnic, practice currently. That's my final comment.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think, friends, we need to wind up now. We are at 4:59, just 1 minute more. Before I wrap up and thank everybody, Sujata, do you want to make any comment?
Wonderful to, get this feedback, and thank you very much for Angela and Vulonkai and Muthu. And of course, Esther, I wonder if she's still there. Wonderful to have you here. Such encouragement for us as we try to get more evidence-based policy into our process. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I totally endorse what Sujata said. Thanks very much to all our reviewers. My only kind of concern is that the Presidential Task Force draft reforms, which we all have with us, and some of us have seen the details, I'm guessing it's a kind of a finalized document which is going to be published as government documents soon. So therefore, if we have a window of opportunity, it will be now. If we are to make any comments and make some suggestions, hoping that some of them at least will be taken into consideration. So we have invited the members of the task force and the ministry. We just had Dr. Ginige, who is ex-NIE, and Priyata, who is currently in the ministry. But let's try our level best, EFSL, and with all you experts around, we will make our very best effort to have our voices heard, at least in this respect. So thank you very much, everybody, once again. And I do hope you will join us when we have our such policy dialogues and research roundtables in the future. Thank you and a good day to everybody.